I and colleagues in the UK have been on over about the last 15 to 16 years, trying better to understand outcomes for babies born at what we're calling here the threshold of viability, which I have to say is an expression which I hate. It's really, what we're interested in is those babies who are the most preterm babies. As far as I know, and we've had a discussion about it in the last few days, but as far as I know, there is no formal definition of extreme prematurity. It's not like we all understand very low birth weight to be below 1,500 grams. And somebody the other day was saying to me, oh, it's under 28 weeks, but I don't actually think that's correct. I think it's what we decide it is. And I'm really talking about babies that are born at 26 completed weeks and more immature than that. This is where I'm from. This is Great Britain, the British Isles. We get very sensitive about it because actually there should be a line across there. Because this is the Republic of Ireland, and the rest is the rest. Divided up into Northern Ireland, Scotland, England and Wales. This is London, and I live here and work about here. And I just put this picture here to show you that the bit of London that I work in is a fantastically diverse place. I cannot tell you how many races, how many languages. And it was really, it's all I have to say, the place is being transformed, because not only have they got a new hospital, they've got an Olympic park, which is about to be used, and the whole place is terribly excited, and I just hope to goodness the traffic works, because at the moment it's awful, because they're frenetically doing roadworks. But I think it was partly because of this community and the fact that we have tremendously variable rates of prematurity in it. We have a large community of women whose origins are in West Africa with fantastically high preterm rates. We have a community of Vietnamese with very few preterm babies. We have a big Hasidic Jewish community with very few preterm babies, and it just got me interested in the whole topic. So I'm going to talk to you about the EPICure studies. I'm going to talk to you about two cohorts. This one has been published, this one keeps being resubmitted. It's just been resubmitted again this morning. And the overall objective of these studies has been to study outcomes following extreme preterm birth. We started off very modestly, thinking we'd follow the children through till they were about 2. But in fact, the funding of this cohort to be studied at the age of 19 is, I gather, now secure, and that's it is me that's doing it. So just to summarise really what these studies look like, the first study recruited over a 10-month period. It wasn't a whole year. And it recruited from this whole geographic area, the whole lot. It was sort of really rather megalomaniacal, quite frankly. We recruited between, you might think, rather mad gestational age ranges of 20 and 25 weeks. The reason we did that was because we were absolutely desperate to capture the whole of the lower end. When we thought about this study and planned it in about 1994, I was struggling with babies at 26, 25 weeks gestational age. I was talking one day with a colleague from St Elsewhere's in England. He said, I'm having a bit of trouble with 23-weekers, and I'm not sure what I should be doing with 22-weekers. And I felt he was obviously working in a different planet from me. So I felt that we really needed to start collecting at very, very low gestation, because otherwise we would miss some of those very immature babies and what was going on with them. So the first study we collected from 276 hospitals. But one important point about this study is that while we did collect a little bit of information about all live births, it was very limited. We couldn't validate their gestational age. We just had the gestational age that the midwife thought the baby was at the time it was being born. Apart from that, we knew its sex, we knew whether it was dead or alive, we hopefully knew its weight, and we knew whether or not it had any obvious congenital malformations. And unless the baby was then admitted to the neonatal unit, we knew no more about it. So for instance, for the babies who were live born but not admitted, and as you can see there were a lot of those, We really don't know. We don't know, for instance, about what the things you've been talking about this morning, about what went on in labour ward with those babies. And as you all know, it's actually very important in terms of how you do later, how good your condition is at birth. And so we changed that when we came on to the second study. So in the first study, we had 811 babies who were admitted to our nurseries. 3 of those were less than 22 weeks. In fact, there were just 2, there were 3 21-weekers. And we don't think any of those survived, although there's a great question mark over the gestational age of one of them. And there were 314 children who were discharged from hospital. And outcome data have now been published for those children at 2, 6 and 11 years. And as I say, they're going to be studied again at 19. When we came to the second study, we just collected in England. England is very densely populated. 82% of the first cohort were born in English hospitals. And we knew that we could recruit enough babies in England. There were no differences between the outcomes between the different countries. And we knew that we could recruit enough babies in England adequately to look at what is happening, or what's been happening more recently, and to look at changes and to answer the questions that we wanted to answer. We changed the gestational age range in that we included babies born at 26 weeks gestational age. We did that for 2 reasons, really. One was we didn't have any good population-based data for those children, and we were interested in what was happening to them, partly because we were looking at centralisation of services. A lot of paediatricians were saying anybody can look after a 26-weeker, and we couldn't argue because we didn't really know what happened to them, whether they were really very different from 25-weekers or whether they weren't. And another thing, of course, that was happening at that time, and many of you will remember, was there were very interesting, and in fact it's all died down a little bit, but there were very interesting discussions in Europe going on at that time, particularly, I'm not sure there are some people here from Holland today? There were all those interesting discussions going on about shock horror. We shouldn't be offering intensive care at 25 weeks and below, or perhaps occasionally a 25-weeker. And whereas in other countries it was pretty well routine to provide intensive care basically to anything that had a heart rate. And that was an interesting discussion. It is an interesting discussion. I'd be fascinated in the views of many people in this room. But basically, one of the things we were interested in was I wasn't aware that anywhere people were saying we shouldn't be providing intensive care routinely for 26-week gestational babies. And so we really wanted to know if they were different, because they do form a rather interesting comparator group. We only went down to 22 weeks, but we did collect information on any live-born baby below that gestational age, and we tried to collect information on all children who weighed more than 400 grams at birth. So it was slightly different. Fewer hospitals, but you see immediately we did collect over a whole year, and something funny's happened because we've got a huge number, seemingly a huge increase in the live births, a lot of admissions. In fact, this was pretty well exactly the number of admissions we predicted from what we knew was going on in English hospitals at that time. And a much bigger cohort of children surviving and going home from hospital. Those children have now been seen, and outcomes have been presented at meetings but not published for their outcomes at 2.5 to 3 years. So I'm going to summarise, rather superficially, inevitably, those data. So I'm going to talk about the principal findings for the first cohort, why on earth you then go and do it all again, particularly when you've got a big cohort of children available to follow. The principal short-term findings from the 2006 cohort, and what seems to have changed. As to what was done, the initial neonatal data collection for both studies, actually, has been a paper exercise looking at short-term morbidity. I longed, and I don't think anybody will ever do this again. I hope that in future it comes from some standardised, wonderful, all singing, all dancing, computerised data system. And you might want to put on a few extra questions for 1 year, but basically somebody presses a button called EPICure study, and out it comes, because I can't believe that anybody will ever again do a paper exercise like this. It was pretty awful. Anyway, sorry. So it was a paper exercise with no controls, no comparator group. The children were seen at 2.5, and that was the aim with the second study, although actually there's been a bit of slippage and they were a bit older. They were seen, had a pediatric and a developmental assessment, and again, no comparator group. At 6 years and 11 years, the design was different because there was a comparator group. It's not strictly a control group, it's a comparator group of children from those EPICure children, and 86% of them were in normal schools. And there was a comparator group who were drawn from the classmates of the EPICure children in normal schools. And insofar as they could, they were matched for sex and ethnicity. They've had fairly comprehensive assessments, particularly so at 11, when a lot of other things were looked at, like the much more detailed spirometry, and there were nested studies of arterial distensibility and pain, and among other things. So just quickly summarise data which have been much walked around. This was the overall survival, pooled, multiple singletons, transfers, not transfers, everything in together. Some people thought they were lower than they expected them to be. Some people said they were higher than they were expected to be. What at the time seemed to be fairly big numbers. Overall survival of 39%. And I put this slide here of very sort of early observations. This is just their short-term neonatal morbidity to make a point, really, not to go through the numbers. That one of the characteristics of these children, and it's been a characteristic of them every time they've been seen, is that the children who have problems tend to have problems in multiple domains. It's that if you study populations of preterm survivors who are born at 32, 33, 34 weeks gestation, they're much more likely to have isolated cerebral palsy or an isolated problem in an area, whereas these children tend to have multiple problems. So this was, I'm leaping ahead, this was the takeaway message when these children were seen at 2.5, and it was one of these very easy things to remember. They had Bailey 2s and a paediatric examination with neurological assessment, and they were split really 3 ways. And another thing which I'm afraid has been very different in the second study is that we had a fantastically high follow-up rate. 92% of them were seen, and those children who weren't seen, we had paediatric reports on the majority of them, so that had we needed to, we could actually have categorized them. And the take-home message, they were classified 3 ways. They either were thought to be functioning normally with no disabilities, or there was a group with so-called severe disability who were children who, to my rather simple mind, were children who the people assessing them at that time thought were likely to remain dependent as they grew up. And then there was a group of children with a host of other abnormalities, minor motor problems, minor visual and hearing impairments, falling into the other disability group. So it was really a half and then 2 quarters. And really it all seemed quite simple, and our original intention of course had been to stop there, and that would have been quite nice and simple. But life's not like that, and they were seen again at 6, and I'm not going to give you a lot of results at 6, other than just again to make this point that at 6 years we didn't see as many of them, and at 11 years slightly fewer were seen. It'll be very interesting when they're seen at 19, when of course the children themselves will have much more say in whether they come for follow-up. In fact, it will be their decision. And I'm hoping that perhaps we might get them to follow up at 19. But as I say, there was a comparator group, and there were 160 of them, and as I've already said, they were drawn from the classes. They weren't matched for ethnicity, I'm sorry, they were matched for age and sex. And each child was seen by a paediatrician and a psychologist. And the only point I will make about these, that we have a 4-way split now in the outcomes. This is the data I've just shown you of the children when they were 2.5. At 6, we have a group that are so-called functioning normally. are functioning normally. We've then got a group with severe disability, moderate and mild, and I'll come on to the definitions. But I just want to ask at this point to draw your attention to this figure, which is the same children and the same assessments, but analysed differently. And this is using the test norms. We have here a Kaufman ABC, which was standardised many years ago to a population norm with an IQ of 100 and a standard deviation of 15. But of course, over time, the IQ of the population tracks upwards, so that when we come to use this test years later, the IQ of the comparator children, as we suspected it would be, was higher. It was actually 106 with a standard deviation of 11. And so you see, given that cognitive disabilities, as we'll see, are by far the most common serious problem these children have, if you use a definition of serious learning problem based on that IQ, and you use a definition of severe as being 3 standard deviations below the norm, moderate as 2, then with a comparator norm of 106 and a standard deviation of 11, you're going to have many more children with problems. And it is the case, and it's a question of how you interpret these data. I'm an intensive care neonatologist. I thought follow-up was really easy. And I've learned a lot since getting involved with these studies, because it is really difficult to interpret what these tests mean. And I'm sure many of you know much more about this than I do. But it's a question of what really matters. We've got children in the mild disability group here, who the only problem they've got is that their IQ is 1 standard deviation below the mean for the comparator group of children. And that means, of course, that they can have an IQ in the low 90s. And many of those children hopefully will go on, or are beginning to go on, and lead independent, happy lives. And I think how we interpret these data, it's very easy to say, oh, only 37% of them are functioning normally. But I think that's putting the worst possible spin on it that we possibly can, or 22%. And I think that we need to have that in mind. So the role of the comparator group in the interpretation of these data is really absolutely critical. This is another favourite slide of those of us who talk regularly about these data. This is IQ against gestational age. And the black squares here are data from our colleague Dieter Volker from a longitudinal study that he undertook some years ago in Bavaria. And this is the IQ of those children at the age of 4.8 years against their gestational age. And you'll see that it begins to fall away at about 32. Now these are standard errors. I've got a version of it with ranges, and it just looks like a briar patch, because of course there are lots of children here well within the normal range. But what is interesting, and this is the regression, this red dotted line, through those Bavarian data, and these are the EPICure children on that same line, and you'll see that they're sitting there on that line. And the take-home message from this is that on average, obviously with huge variation, but on average, from about 32 weeks downwards, the IQ of the surviving children loses about 2.5 to 3 points for every week of gestational age. Now, if you start out with a potential IQ of 140 or so, that's not so bad. But of course, if you start out with a potential IQ of 100 or less, that's a pretty serious message. And so I'm going to skip on to the children at 11, because in many ways, the findings of these children at 11 are really very similar from what they were at 6. Don't worry about the detail on this, you probably can't read it anyway, but it's really just to make the point that following up these cohorts is really very difficult. Some children who weren't seen at 2.5, weren't seen at 6, emerged at 11. Likewise, children are dropping out, and in fact there are only 100 or 200 children here who've actually been seen at all 3 follow-up points. That's, you remember, of an original 314 children discharged from hospital, of whom we're only aware of 8 having died. So they're all falling in and out. And so obviously it becomes very important to think about the children who we are not seeing. And this is a rather complicated slide. I used to have a very simple one, but Neil Marlowe, who does all the follow-up, really, not me, tells me I should use this one. And the message of it, we have the same message at 6 o'clock, at 6 years. Basically, if we looked at the children who weren't coming for follow-up, when we looked at their perinatal characteristics, what they looked like as babies, they really looked very similar to the children who were seen. But if we looked at the children who failed to come for follow-up at both 6 years and at 11 years, there was an over-representation of those children who, when they were seen at 2.5, had been in that severely disabled, expected to be dependent group. And that, of course, has been a feature of other people's follow-up studies. And so the concern is that we're not seeing a disproportionate number of the children with the biggest problems. So it might be that we're putting a slightly good gloss on some of these data, while at the same time I think it's very easy to overinterpret them and think that things are worse than they are. Now, I skated over the classification of disability at 6, but this is the classification of disability at 11, which is exactly the same, except at 6 there was, at 11, an element about communication was added in. There's the group classified as severely disabled, who either have cerebral palsy and can't walk, aren't mobile. Their hearing problem is so severe that it cannot be corrected, or are registered blind, have no communication, or any of these, or a combination of them, an IQ more than 3 standard deviations below the mean. And the figures I'm going to show you are the mean of the comparator group, not the population mean for the IQ test. There's then a moderate group who can have any of ambulant cerebral palsy, a hearing loss not completely corrected with hearing aids, impaired vision but not registered as blind. They sign, and there was a small number of children, please don't ask me exactly how many it was because I actually can't remember, but there was a small number of children with no oral communication but who signed. Or an IQ 2 to 3 standard deviations down. And then the mild group, mild motor problems, a bit of clumsiness, mild hemiplegias, a lot of minor visual problems, a lot of amblyopia, hearing problems corrected, able to communicate with a combination of speech and signing, or, as I've already said, a small deficit in their IQ. Sorry. And this is what the results look like, all put together, compared with the comparator group. And they're very similar to the results at 6 years. There's a fairly small group, only 16% of the children, who seem at 11 to be functioning normally in all areas, and about the same number of children with a severe group. A big group of children, 28%, but the whole lot here adding up to 45%, so a large number of children, and I think this is where there was a television programme about these results in the UK, and I think a lot of people got a very, very gloomy view about the future for these children from those data. But I do think we need to be a bit careful about the interpretation of them. And then another very big group of children with mild disabilities. And as I've already made the point, many of these children, one would hope, would be independent and able to be fulfilled and have some fun. These are the cerebral palsy data. Overall, 17% of the children had either mild or moderate cerebral palsy. 4% of them were non-ambulant. I find the cerebral palsy data interesting because 20 years ago, if I'd been asked to speak to parents threatened with very preterm labour, I would have talked about cerebral palsy in my ignorance, really. But actually, Severe cerebral palsy is not that common, although obviously these aren't insignificant. But on the other hand, I think there is an element with this outcome of selection going on. Because a large number of children who die in the UK have their intensive care actively withdrawn, their life support withdrawn. And there's no question that amongst the children, and in fact that's increased between the two EPICure cohorts, so that over 66% of the children who died in the second cohort had active withdrawal of life support. And there is no question in both cohorts that amongst the children from whom we're withdrawing life support, there's a very high number of children with severe bilateral changes on their cerebral ultrasound scans. And I think that's the one finding in many of our units that we feel many people think that they should discuss with the parents the possibility of withdrawing intensive care with that finding. And we don't with many other things because we can't pick out those children, quite frankly, whose IQs are necessarily going to be low. So I think they're slightly curious, the cerebral palsy results. Much more cerebral palsy in boys than girls. And as I think with some other findings from the EPICure cohorts, big differences between the 25-weekers and the 24-23-weekers. There really seems to be almost a stepwise change in the findings once you get beyond 24 weeks. This is slightly complicated, but I put it there really just to make a point. This is the severe or moderate group, with the EPICure children here, their classmates here, and these various domains. And I just really put this up to make the point that here's the cerebral palsy data we've just seen. Relatively low rates of severe sensory impairments, but you can see just how dominant the learning problems are as the problem these children have, and why the understanding of those IQ tests is so fundamental, really, to understanding the outcomes for these children. And this is the mild group. And again, quite a lot of children with minor motor problems, an awful lot of children with minor visual problems. And as you all know, it's jolly difficult keeping specs on toddlers and catching eyes and such like and so forth. An awful lot of that having to go on. And again, about 30% of those children with minor reductions of their IQs. These are the data the raw data for IQ, broken down by sex, with the boys in blue and the girls in red by gestational age. And it's interesting because these are the comparator children with absolutely no difference between the boys and the girls. But you've got this 10-point IQ difference between the boys and the girls amongst the extremely immature survivors. These are learning disabilities. And one of the things which has been very striking about these children is that they're particularly bad at mathematics. They find that find it really, really difficult to do sums. They also find it very difficult to do more than one thing at the same time. They're bad multitaskers. And obviously things are arranged differently in different countries. But as I've already said, we have 13% of them in special schools. Some of those, of course, because of motor problems and sensory problems rather than learning problems. But even those children who are in mainstream schools, a huge proportion of them are having some form of additional small classwork or individual tuition out of hours. And the resource consumption by these children in terms of educational resource is really enormous. And I've, over the last few years, several times gone to talk to groups of teachers, and I've really found myself very much in the firing line, because they are very conscious of preterm survivors in their classes really not doing very well, and sometimes being disruptive. This is just an indication of the resource dependency of those children. The one-to-one, the dark blue children are the EPICure children, the light blue children are their classmates, and as you can see, it's one-to-one support, small group support, bit of physio, speech and language therapy, but a lot of extra help being put in order to help them to be help them to stay in the mainstream school. This is the severe, moderate, mild, no disability all put together. I've really just put this up to make this, again, an important point, that the boys are twice as likely to have a severe abnormality as are the girls. And this other very important point, it was apparent when we saw the children when they were 6 years old, that there were some children who were thought to have been absolutely normal in all domains when they were 2.5, who had very obvious problems when they were 6. And the same was true when the children were seen at 11. What we have here is the children grouped by their disability when they were 6 years old. And yes, if they were thought to have a severe, if they were thought to have, and the colours are what they were at 6. So if they're yellow, they were thought to have, no, sorry, this is at 6 and this is 11. So here are the children who were thought to have a severe disability when they were 6, and yes, most of them at 11 have either a severe or a moderate disability, but a few of them don't. We think that was largely because we had the most fantastic psychologist came to work with us, Sam Johnson, who worked with the children at 11, and she spent ages doing IQs on children with severe sensory problems and managed to get some of these children who people had really pretty well written off earlier on, really perform rather well. But what I think is really important is that down here, amongst the children who were thought to have only very minor problems when they were 6, there are quite a lot of children with moderate problems. Some of these are motor problems, some are IQ, their IQ seems to have failed, and a couple of children here with severe problems when seen at 11. Now again, I think it depends how secure our systems are for following these children up. In the UK, it's been very patchy. And in some places, these children are followed for several years. In some places, if they're functioning normally at 2, they're discharged and seen just with normal children. And that can't be satisfactory. It's far too early to assess them. And obviously, neither do we want to stigmatise these children. But it does seem to me important that teachers and parents are conscious that if somewhere along the line these children are beginning to fail, that it needs to be flagged up. That they were an extremely preterm baby. And of course, often they have parents who don't necessarily even have the skills to push for the extra help that those children need. The other thing which Sam Johnson has done a lot of work with, which is rather disturbing and again is very apparent from other series, is the incidence of autistic spectrum symptoms amongst these children, which have been assessed using a social communication questionnaire and also the Dormer, which is a very detailed questionnaire administered to parents and to teachers. And these results have been published, and I don't want to linger on them, but this is the questionnaire study, and basically what we have here is the yellow children, which I think just about probably show up, are the classmates. The green ones are the EPICure surviving children, and basically using this score between these two dotted lines are children in sort of threshold area, and as you can see there are a few yellow children here, but many more green, and there's no yellow children up here. These are children definitely within the autistic range, and these are all the extremely preterm follow-ups. Using the Dormer, which actually assigns a psychiatric diagnosis to these children, and I've just summarised here some very detailed data published by Sam Johnson. What we find is that if we look at raw data for the EPICure survivors, a lot of them have a psychiatric diagnosis. Most of it is ADHD, a lot of emotional lability, but then here, 8% of them with an autistic spectrum disorder, and 6.5%, that's obviously included within that 8, actually having a clinical diagnosis of autism. Now, if we adjust that for the neurosensory and cognitive problems of these children, these disappear, but we're left with this, however we control for it, there is excess autistic type behaviour. Whether or not it's the same disease that we see in children born more mature, I think it's a very fascinating area. But certainly the phenotype of these children is that of autism. And then the thing which I have to say I find distressing, their growth and interesting. I will show you a little bit of data from the second study. These are those children who were measured at each of these 4 time points: at birth, at around about their expected date of delivery, at 2.5, and at 6. And you can see these are standard deviation scores, weight and OFC. We tried to do length. We weren't very good at lengthening in the UK in 1995, and shamefully we're worse in 2006. But you see this dreadful growth failure, and I really don't think there's another word for it, on our neonatal units. Once the children go home, their weight standard deviation stabilised with some catch-up, and also I might say some catch-up in those children who are heighted between 2.5 and 6. Their head circumferences, though, had fallen further below by the time they were 2.5, and predictably, of course, they don't change thereafter. So very, very poor growth. These are their Z scores, and I'll show you some, basic. These are the Z scores up to the age of 11. And rather surprisingly, there's been quite a lot of catch-up of weight between 6.5 and 11, and there's indeed also been some catch-up of height. So that if you look at their BMIs, they're actually approaching the normal range. I always tend to think of extremely preterm survivors as being rather short, very thin children. But the BMI, the BMI of, oh goodness, what am I doing? The BMI of these children is going up towards normal, and of course the interesting and worrying question is what's going to happen. It will be very interesting to see what they look like when they're 19. Virtually none of these children was in puberty at the age of 11. I'm going to skate over this, but we've also done quite detailed looking at their respiratory function. This is just looking at their symptomatology and use of medications. And we've got the classmates here in white, and then the EPICure children divided simply by whether or not they were still in oxygen at 36 weeks. So a very crude definition of bronchopulmonary dysplasia. And as you can see, there's a stepwise, obviously there's quite a bit of wheeze in the comparator children down here, but there's a stepwise finding in terms of the respiratory symptomatology for these children at 11. They had very detailed spirometry done, and these were the people seeing the children were trained, and then they were all analysed centrally by my colleague Janet Stocks, her team at Great Ormond Street. And I've just shown you an example of their FEVs, their FEV1s, and as you can see, again, we've got this stepwise changes between these children with a lot of airways problem in these EPICure survivors. And this is a rather sort of disturbing figure of Janet Stocks's. This is where we would expect normal people to be in terms of their lung capacity, lung reserve. Some of you are way up here, some of us, me, is down here somewhere, but hopefully still with quite a bit of reserve and not having to take too many breaths mid-sentence. This is the trajectory that our extremely preterm survivors seem to be on. And that's not great. And it'll be very interesting, again, to look at their lung function as they get a bit older, because, of course, the worry is that they're going to begin to get problems in early adult life, particularly, of course, if they start smoking too many cigarettes. And a whole lot of other stuff, which I'll happily talk to you about, and I wasn't going to show you details. There's a difference in their perception of pain. They have reduced perception of pain. Those children whose we didn't find blood pressure differences, but reduced compliance of their blood vessels. So overall, in summary, The rates of disability at 11 were really very little changed. I haven't shown you the detailed at sixes, but they were tracking really very well. About 40% have got a significant cognitive impairment in comparison with their peers. High levels of special educational need, a lot of behavioural problems, autistic spectrum disorder, a lot of respiratory morbidity, particularly in those who'd had BPD, and this important finding that we're still picking up children we thought were okay but seem to have developmental problems which we think must be attributable to their prematurity. Well, why do it again? Well, there were two really main reasons. We were being attacked by some of our colleagues saying, well, we were always better than your EPICure results in our hospital. I have to say the evidence didn't really show that, but we didn't find much difference between hospitals in the way they're organised or were organised in the UK. But people were saying, well, they were never much use for us, and anyway, we're doing so much better now that the results are of no relevance. And of course, meanwhile, we were interested in following these children because we've got a big cohort of extremely preterm children. But we need to know that following them is useful for other than just in academic terms. We need to know that following them up is going to give us information which might be useful for those of us who need to speak to parents on the labour room and in our nurseries when they've got a very small baby. Also, we thought we might do it rather better and improve on some of the deficiencies of the first study. So we had some sort of hypotheses, which I have to say I've been attacked about a lot recently. We thought survival would have gone up even in England. We were suspicious. There isn't really very good data. I know there are studies, there's very, very good data, for instance, from the state of Victoria in Australia, that over time, in birth weight-derived cohorts, but including babies who are a lot more mature than these babies, that morbidity is improving as well as survival. But it's not really clear, once you drill down into these very, very low gestations, that morbidity is improving. And as many of you will know, there were data published last year by Susan Hinz, which really showed that there didn't seem to have been any improvement in the outcomes for surviving children, contemporary surviving children. So we thought we'd look again, and as I've already said, we included the 26-weekers, and we wanted to look at changes, and I've shown you this already, and I'm just going to show you what seem to be the main messages coming out of that. And the first thing you've already got a hint of is that we've got something very funny going, well, not funny, actually rather serious, going on in England, which is, this is the number of English admissions in the first EPICure study. There has been an increase in the birth rate. And if we look at national statistics, we would have expected that to have gone up a bit when we repeated the study in 2006. But in fact, it's gone up massively. Now, you might think, well, you're just successfully resuscitating more babies on labour ward. And as I say, we didn't have details about what had gone on labour ward in the first study. But I don't think we were so bad at gestational age assessment that it accounts for that. We also know that in 2006, at 24, 25 weeks, almost everybody who was live born was actually admitted to the nursery. The real differences, babies not being admitted are at lower gestations. So there really does seem to have been a huge increase in the number of babies, and certainly that's been the experience of many people on the ground. It was interesting, it's a time of the EU opening up to Eastern European countries, a lot of economic migration in Europe. There's always migration into the UK from the places that Great Britain colonised 100, 200 years ago. But we are doing some work. We've got a very bright PhD student looking at this because we really need to try better to understand it because it represents a real public health problem, quite frankly. These are the survival data, and these are the data here. The survival has gone up. But the point I'd make particularly for this audience is that because we've now got details on everybody, this is alive at the onset of labour. This is the population in the white bars who are either alive at the onset of labour or who had a caesarean section and were believed to be alive at the beginning of the operation. The next column is a sort of light green colour are the live births and then the admissions.
Now, once you're up to 25, 26 weeks, you're fairly unlikely to die in labour. And if you're live born, you're probably going to be admitted to the neonatal unit unless something catastrophic has gone on. But below that, that's much less likely. And in fact, at 23 weeks, the figures are really very different. For if you look at survival by survival of live births or survival of admissions, and you're slightly more likely indeed to be an intrapartum death, although they're relatively unusual. But obviously if we're talking to parents on labour ward, this is important because people tend to use numbers. I have to say I avoid using numbers. But some people like to use numbers. And if you use numbers, you need to be really careful that you know what denominator you're using, because it makes a great deal of difference at very low gestation. These are comparative data for survival to discharge from hospital. Now, although we collected 26 weeks in 2006, we don't, of course, have comparative data from 1995. So this is survival to discharge with the EPICure 1 study in yellow and the EPICure 2 in blue. And as you can see, survival has increased, not statistically significantly below 24 weeks, but it has increased at each gestational age, and overall, there's a highly statistically significant increase in survival. These are survival curves for the population of babies admitted out to 120 days, with the second study, the 2006 study in blue, and the first study in green. Now, obviously, as we all know, most babies who die fairly soon after admission to the neonatal unit, and certainly within the first week. And one of the interesting things, as soon as one eyeballs these curves, is that they look pretty parallel after the first few days of life. So as soon as we saw these, I said, what happens if we do survival curves for the children who have all survived the first week? And of course, this is what happens. There's absolutely no difference at all. And I haven't got time today to show you all the data, but looking at these data, we are being given babies by the obstetricians who are in slightly better condition. There's been more exposure to antenatal steroids. Caesarean section, I might say, of these lower gestations in the UK is fairly unusual, and I know varies greatly from country to country. And I think that we are probably slightly better, not perfect by any means, but slightly better at how we look after them on the labour ward and in the first few days of life. I have to say they almost all had some oxygen. Although many at the hospital said they were resuscitating, they almost all had some oxygen, they were almost all intubated. Virtually everybody got surfactant. We can't do an analysis by whether or not the babies did or didn't get surfactant. But the fact of the matter is we get them through that first week, and we get more of them through that first week. But having survived the first week, they're no more likely to go home from hospital than they would have been had they survived the first week in 1995. The improvement is all there in the first week. And, oh, I've taken out a slide. I've taken out a slide, possibly because I think I might be going to show it to you tomorrow. I've taken out a slide which shows that if you look at what people regard as being the principal cause of death, deaths due to pulmonary insufficiency, those are the very early respiratory deaths. The babies we couldn't get on top of the ventilation right at the beginning. Those have become less common. But a higher proportion of the deaths than in 1995 are attributed to sepsis, most of which is late onset, and necrotizing enterocolitis. And we're getting the babies through that first week. And then, of course, we've got a big population of very vulnerable babies, many of whom survived in 1995. And they're getting these later complications, which I think it's so urgent that we develop strategies to deal with. I'm going to show you very quickly, just whiz through a little bit of morbidity data. We've focused in these very early results very much on those things that we think most best predict how these children might do later on. So we've looked at cerebral ultrasound scans. We've looked at this last scan that we have available to us. Most of these are done after the age of 6 weeks. And in the first EPICure study, we found that that was a better predictor of what happened subsequently than the earlier scans. We've classified babies having bad scans as babies who either have hydrocephalus or have parenchymal cysts or indeed have hemorrhagic parenchymal infarcts on their scans. So we've looked at those, we've looked at babies still in oxygen at 36 weeks, treated retinopathy of prematurity. In the second study, we know the most severe stage of retinopathy, we know the ages at which the babies were screened, but we don't have that detail for 1995, when screening wasn't nearly as universal or as standardised as it is now. And the only data we have from 1995 was whether the baby had retinopathy of prematurity so severe that it was treated. It's been a great relief to us that in the follow-up of the 1995 children, we haven't actually found any children with severe visual impairments attributable to missed retinopathy. We've got some children who we knew had bad retinopathy, but none missed. But I think that's good luck rather than anything else. And I wanted to show you some comparative growth data. So these are the babies from the EPICure 2 cohort surviving with a bad scan. And as I say, this should have hemorrhagic parenchymal infarct as well, in it as well. And as you can see, there are about 12% or so of them, and there's no real difference across this gestational age range. And as I say, there is some selection in here around withdrawal of life support. These are the BPD data using this very simple definition, and here we have a lot of BPD. It's about 74% in the population at 25 weeks and below. I thought at first that was worse than other countries, but when you really try and look at population-based data in other countries, I'm not sure that that's really so true. But a very obvious gestational age range relationship, as we would expect. And these are the retinopathy of prematurity. This is treated retinopathy in 2006 with a very strong relationship, again, as we would obviously predict, to gestational age. It's very obvious looking at the data in detail that ophthalmologists are varying. Some of them are really treating retinopathy fairly early on. And these are the comparative data. This again, we're back to having the 1995 in yellow and the EPICure in blue. Here's the increase in survival. These are all survivors, 25 weeks and below. The increase in survival that we've already seen, absolutely no change in the proportion of surviving children with severe abnormalities on their last available cerebral ultrasound scan. Absolutely no change in the number of them who were oxygen dependent at 36 weeks, and an increase in the number treated for retinopathy. Now, of course, this is difficult to interpret because there's been a change in practice. There's no question that screening is better applied, more available by more skilled people than it was. And as I say, I think the threshold for treating is changing. And it's easy to say, oh, this is just a practice change. But of course, on the other hand, one was concerned when one first saw these data that there are more vulnerable children coming through, and it may be that we really do have more severe retinopathy. But interestingly, it does appear on the 3-year outcomes for those children who've been assessed that we don't seem to have increased visual impairment, which I have to say is one thing I'm rather relieved about. And these are the comparative growth data. I mean, I could interchange these. These are the 1995. This is weight. This is occipitofrontal circumference at birth and expected date of delivery for surviving children. And as you can see, we're no better in 2006. I don't think anybody around the world is much better. And I have to say, I don't know about you people, I was looking at the programme today, and I have to say, I do think we ought to be having a session on nutrition, shouldn't we? We're talking about very small babies, which we don't have, probably rather than one of my talks tomorrow, but there we go. But it is interesting that for many years, people seem to have lost interest. We were all focused on the brain and on the lungs and rather have forgotten about nutrition. And there does, to me, seem to be a bit of renewed interest. People are getting better, more interested in how we get breast milk in earlier, how we get more breast milk, interested in the quality of TPN, the mixtures, quite frankly, until recently not having changed for years. And hopefully we might begin to see a bit of improvement in this, because this reflects bad brain growth. We know that. Whether we can improve that We don't really know, but we need desperately to do something about it. I've nearly finished. I don't really want to dwell in this, but things have changed over those 11 years, and these are all items which in 1995 were related. This is ethnicity, the use of antenatal steroids, the condition of the baby at birth, which we measure by whether or not the heart rate is over 105 minutes. I'm not interested in that class of these babies. Hypothermia below 35, exposure postnatally to surfactant, transfer to a centre, a neonatal centre within the first 24 hours, which actually had increased a higher proportion of babies being whizzed around in the back of ambulances in 2006, and exposure to postnatal steroids. This is percentage of survivors, and of course it's interesting because those children who received postnatal steroids in 2006 will have received much less than they would have done in 1995, which was the actual zenith of our giving dexamethasone to babies, thinking we were helping their BPD. And I put these things up because, interestingly, the frequency of all of them has changed significantly between these two cohorts, mostly for the better, and particularly this dramatic fall in the number of children whose temperature was less than 35 on admission to the neonatal units. Mind you, it's still sitting at about 13%. And I think this is in part of course, due to the introduction of occlusive wrapping, although if you control for occlusive wrapping, there's still a very strong gestational age effect there, and some very tiny babies still get cold. This filled me with great cheer as to whether that might possibly, despite the fact that we were seeing no differences in the very short-term morbidity, whether because there'd been such a dramatic reduction in the use of postnatal steroids, whether we might see differences when we came on to assess these children later. So one would speculate on that basis that possibly with increased use of evidence-based interventions, and babies in good condition at birth, we might expect to see more surviving children with fewer impairments. But, as I say, the short-term morbidity would count against that. Now, I'm only showing you this one slide from the follow-up on these children. The follow-up on these children is a source of great pain to many of us. I've shown you that in the first EPICure cohort, we saw 92% of these children face-to-face at the age of 2.5. We've had huge changes in the regulation and so-called governance, it's meant to be protecting people, of clinical research in the UK. And it has become very, very much more difficult. It's become particularly difficult. We found it terribly difficult to follow these children up. And actually, only 55%, which is a shocking number, of the cohort have been seen. And because there are all sorts of problems, they've been seen at an older age, and, as any of you interested in the niceties of follow-up will know, the Bailey 2 has been replaced by the Bailey 3, and that in itself has presented a problem because it's almost too complicated and too clever for me, but the Bailey 3 undoubtedly, particularly at the lower ranges, is underestimating disabilities in these children. So there are a great number of problems. These are pooled data with no disability in white, severe in black, and or died in black, sorry, the severe and the other disability. Remember, we've just got a three-way categorization at the age of 2.5, 3. And there are not very big changes. But there is a suggestion that there's a bit of polarizing of these children. But quite frankly, I worry about these data. I worry because of the small number that have been seen. The statisticians have been doing imputation all over the place. And you know, this is, I worry about things I used to call fudge factors. And how valid this really is, and we desperately need to see these children when they're a bit older and actually do their IQs, doing a test that we can really rely on. But there does seem to be some polarization, so that we've actually got a slightly higher proportion, well, at least we've got a slight increase, but it's not statistically significant, of children with severe disabilities. But we do seem to have also a slight increase in the 25-weekers at least, of survivors with no disability. So I think what we've got, at least in England, and this has been the first sort of opportunity worldwide to look at one of these national cohorts and to repeat it and look at change over a period of time. But I think what we seem to have in England is a huge increase in the number of preterm births. And if you look at, there's that nice comparative European study which suggests that for some reason, and reasons we don't well understand in the UK, we do have high rates, although of course they're not as high as the rates in the United States. But they're high. We have an increase. We have increased survival, not as high as the survival rates reported from Sweden as the Express study, who continue to be the winners, I think, in everything. But they are higher than they used to be in the UK. We have no real differences in the short-term morbidity, and I don't think we've got very much in the way of change at the findings at 2.5 and 3 for these children. The pattern of impairments in the children is really very similar to what it was. The cerebral palsy rates aren't changed, but it is going to be very important to follow these children later on. So I'm going to stop at that point. I'm merely the messenger. This has been a huge collaborative effort by a group of researchers, but I think particularly by midwives, neonatal nurses, neonatal doctors, right through the UK. And recently, mercifully, our funding has been picked up by the Medical Research Council, so we don't have to beg, borrow and steal all the time, which has been a great relief. I've stopped. I've probably talked for far too long, but I'm really tremendously interested in your own experiences, and we can talk about them in the next 10 minutes. I'll talk to questions. I'll happily. I'm terribly interested in what people think is happening in their own countries and what's happening to numbers of preterm births and whether you have a good feel for what's going on, Sandra.
So I've heard different interpretations of the differences in the Bailey 2 and the Bailey 3.
You're not going to quiz me on that one.
No, I just wanted to throw it out for discussion because some people are saying clearly babies are scoring higher on the Bailey 3, 10, 15 points. The question is that going to correlate better with long-term outcomes?
Well, this is why I realised
estimated poor outcomes.
Possibly, and this is why, as I say, I used to think that follow-up was easy, and anybody could do follow-up, and I've just realised how fantastically difficult the interpretation of these things is in terms of what we want for our children. You know, we want them to be able to be independent, we want them to be happy, we want them to be able to get around, and I don't know. I don't know other people in the room. I mean, there is a problem, and our statisticians have constructed some frightfully convoluted, because the problem is not linear. The discrepancy is not linear. Marilyn.
But if you look at what's being thrown at these children in terms of resources, the problem is, as our follow-up group said, they're all going into normal schools because there just isn't that wanting to separate them for special education, which is terribly expensive. So you start saying...
So which is very expensive? They're both expensive. We've got special education or
special education is really becoming... We don't want to stigmatise these children. They're all going into normal schools. So then you're starting to say, as we all are, so you've got this child with this apparent massive disability, but she's now in a normal school. So, you know, where do you say, in terms of what you've come back to say, was it the Bailey 3 overestimating, underestimating? But they're in normal school at 5. Or 6, depending on whether you're putting them into school at 5 or putting them into school at 6, where they're less likely to fail or look that different. So that's the other conundrum. Then trying to take it back to your assessment at 2 or 3, which is it's an impossible question to answer. But it's just that there's a large number of them coming through. Resources are becoming more challenge, for a better word, say a better word, and we're seeming that we don't want to discriminate against these children, and so maybe they'll do better if they're actually in a normal school, rubbing along with their peers.
But in big classes, teachers...
Oh, it's hopeless for the teacher.
It can be difficult.
Yeah.
A question to one of the slides where you show the the 6 years evaluation against the 11 years.
Yes.
Yeah.
There's a group with 6 years who are severe disabled. And with 11 years, there are a couple of kids who are normal. How is it?
Well, I think I think that what I'm told. I'm not the person who does the follow-up. My colleague Neil Marlowe leads the follow-up, and most of those analyses have been done by Sam Johnson. What I'm told is that those are children with severe sensory problems who the testers, I think, rather gave up on at 6, and that Sam Johnson has persevered with and has got an IQ for. And that's why they've moved category. Because I questioned, I said this is
unbelievable that you have
yes. Their cerebral palsy hasn't got better, and their vision and hearing. It's a movement. It's the testing of their IQs that's resulting in some rather bizarre movements between groups. But I'm not. I mean, I don't know. Probably people in the room who are experts in it. I'm not. But that I'm told is the reason for that rather curious. That their children who previously they failed to get an IQ for, and so they're given a low score.
You said about the high risk of autism and autistic disorders in extremely premature babies. You noticed it. Could it be the impact of the relationship between the family and the children and the long hospital stay?
Yes.
Or the way the parents see the children, ex-premature, ex-vulnerable children, once he or she gets home?
I mean, the answer is, of course, that we don't know. And as I say, again, one's outside one's own comfort zone with an increasing number of these topics. But again, it's a phenotype. And to what extent it's actually the same developmental brain problem that a more mature child with autism has. There's a lot of discussion going on. But you're right. But I mean, often if we think about the sensory, I mean, I know some of us are into NIDCAP and some, but however hard we try, the sensory environment of these children from the moment of their birth is hugely different from what it would normally be. And we don't know, but it's a very interesting question, and I'm sure that it's something which people, there's a huge interest in this now, because we're not the only people who've shown this. It's apparent in other series that this type of behavioural problem is very much present within these cohorts of extremely preterm children. And I think it underlines how important it is. Somebody already mentioned, there's no question that once we define these cohorts by gestation, as opposed to looking at an extremely low birth weight cohort, where we're inevitably going to have some more mature but small children with different problems, these problems begin to become clearer. And I think that's one of the ways in which these gestationary age defined cohorts are so particularly useful in trying to understand these problems, but we're miles away from really understanding it.
Do you have a psychologist in your unit to help mothers and families overcome the shock of...
Sadly, no. Some places do. I don't know how many. Do people have psychologists working on their units with mothers and babies?
Yes.
Lucky you. Yeah. Well, we used to have a long time ago, but they've gone, along with a lot of other lovely things we used to have. We had a psychiatrist for the doctors. But they've all gone. Mario, you were going to ask something.
I think that the issue of the Bailey 2 and Bailey 3, I mean, one of the things I remember that they said there was an advantage is that the Bailey 3 was more sensitive to picking up fine motor disorders, which was not good in Bailey 2. But again, it's a tool that you use to measure something. And depending on the sensitivity and the specificity of that tool and the predictive value, positive and negative, you might pick some of the things but lose sensitivity and vice versa. And I think that it's how we measure. We're not sure. And I was talking about the caffeine study, but remember the indomethacin trial, where at 1 year of age, you know, they within the medicine, they, you know, were looking at, you know, that you were able to decrease grade 3 and 4 intrathecal hemorrhage, but you didn't find anything in development outcome. Everybody, every neonatologist said, how could it be if you have a grade 3 and 4 and that you're not going to be able to pick up more morbidity? It just isn't logical. So something in the tool, that's where the conundrum is. And so how do you find a tool? Because these tools really have not been studied appropriately in randomized control trials, but you have to depend on something.
That's right.
So how you measure, I think, is important, but at the end of the day, what really matters is how many services are these children requiring.
Yes.
That's the bottom line, because you might not have a lot of information on your Bailey, but if you're using a tremendous amount of services and that's increasing proportionally to the increase in the survival, something's really not right. And it's clear that they put them into these schools, but in the schools they're not getting the services that they really need. They're blending into the group.
Being lost, because they tend, you know, not to be very forceful children. You know, they tend to be a bit retiring and a bit quiet, in fact. I mean, I know some of them have got ADHD, these have been attentive sort of ADHD. And they tend, you know, and as you know, Suresh Segal's work and Richard Cook and people who study cohorts going on much longer, they tend to be rather quiet. You know, they're not into sex, drugs and rock and roll. They're not naughty children, and they're not, and so they get lost in class, which is very worrying.
So I think that's what's concerning about, because now we're looking at a longer term cohort, and we're seeing, you know, that what's happening with morbidity and really not seeing that progress, and so it's sort of a red light. What is it? Are we doing the right thing with how we're caring for these children, or is it that all these interventions that we apply are very expensive but don't really make a difference in ultimate outcomes?
Well, I think they are making a difference, but I mean, I personally, you know, I'm ever an optimist, and I hope that we will do better. I think there are areas where we might do better, and I think they come down to nutrition and infection, and nutrition and infection.
So I was going to say that's the next cohort, isn't it?
What is normal school in England?
What
is normal school?
What is normal school?
Yeah, because I think the society, in fact in our country, the normal school is getting more and more narrow. There's not many children that is normal anymore.
Gosh, where do you live?
In Denmark. In Denmark, a lot of children are problem.
Well, we still, yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Well, as you can see, there was usage of those resources by the comparator children, but although not as much. No, you're right. There are a lot of children who still need extra going in. What age do children start going to school in Denmark?
6 or 7 years.
Yeah. We still push them in at a 4 rising 5. They don't do nearly as well as in most of your countries.
I ask you, because the congratulations for the huge amount of information that can come in.
Yes.
Absolutely astonishing. Maybe a trivial issue, but the issue of growth. I remember correctly from your graph, the 23, 24 weeks is started from for the median weight, and I guess you use a birth weight reference. And then they lose 2 standard deviation at term. That's one.
Now, we've actually done them both ways, interestingly. And yes, I think the data I've shown you use the UK Child Growth Foundation norms.
Based on birth rate.
Yes.
Yes, because
Yes.
I think it's important, maybe, if this is a question, maybe this population is not, as here on the graph, all extrauterine growth population, but also intrauterine. If you measure the data, if you measure the weight with a fetal reference, maybe you can see that they start from 1, for example, the standard deviation below, and then of course they accumulate growth retardation afterwards, but also into uterus.
Well, it's a very interesting question. We've had endless discussions about it, and we did even just, you know, we just used our own population of live births at one point.
if we use our own population of live births and construct a birth percentile on that, it doesn't really look very different, but it's a very interesting and important point, and I don't think anybody really knows what is the right thing to do. One cheering thing, and I'm now going to forget the numbers, is that there is definitely more usage of breast milk in the second cohort, and I can't remember the numbers, but I think it's over 50% of them are still receiving some maternal breast milk at discharge from hospital, which for, for us actually is a great deal better than it would be a few years ago. And they pretty well all have breast milk at first, have their mother's milk, almost all of them, which is an improvement.
I found very interesting, very impressive, the reduction in the use of postnatal steroids in the second study.
But still 17% of survivors received it, but none of them received it in the first week, not a single baby, whereas in the first study there were still babies receiving postnatal steroids in the first week of life, and in fact many of us were wondering whether we shouldn't get them in early, because we could damp down that horrible inflammation in the lung. We don't have any dosage. I can't remember them offhand, but I do have the doses and the duration of courses given in the second study. We have no dosage data from the first study, but we do have the number of days that children received postnatal steroids for. And those children treated in the second study were given them for a much shorter length of time. I can't remember the numbers, but it's much reduced from the first study.
But it doesn't reflect in the amount of the severe disability, which is...
Well, it's asking, I think it's asking an awful lot. I mean, I hoped it might. Ever optimistic. It's asking an awful lot in this very heterogeneous population with so many comorbidities. I think that one intervention or removal of one poison is really going to make a quantum difference. I'm sure it's a good thing. I mean, on the other hand, some people might argue that perhaps we're not using quite enough. And as you know, there's some fascinating papers analysing where the break point is in terms of the disadvantages of giving steroids and the advantages of giving steroids. Both in terms of which babies, how early, how much. I think many of us have withheld steroids in situations where we should jolly well have tried them in the last few years.